So I'm Laura Whiteley-Binder. I work with the Climate Impacts Group at the University of Washington, and I will tell you a little bit about us in a minute. Just want to point out, though, that I made sure to wear my WSU red. I have two neighbors behind me, and one went to UW, and one went to WSU, and when one of them goes out of town, they've been known to go hang the other school's flag on the neighbor's house. So the UW neighbor comes home to find the WSU flag hanging on his porch. The WSU family comes home to find the UW flag hanging on their porch. So we've got a good rivalry going on even in my backyard. So my purpose today is to talk to you about a large body of research that has relevant to the region on climate change impacts, and then to take it to the level of how it relates to ag and animal production. I'm going to talk about ag generally, recognizing that when we talk about dairy and cattle, for example, they are not isolated units. What's happening with water supply and grain production and hay production obviously has impacts. So I'm talking broadly here. So the Climate Impacts Group is an interdisciplinary research group based at the University of Washington that studies the impacts of climate variability and climate change on the Northwest and other regions as well. We work at scales from an individual watershed to the Western U.S. Most of our work has been focused on the Pacific Northwest since our establishment in 1995, so we've been around for a while now. We are both research faculty as well as technical staff. And the objective of our work is to produce scientific information that is useful to decision makers and actually used by decision making. So our work is very applied. We do research from dealing with the fundamentals of climate in the region, climate dynamics, to the application of that information to decision making, for example, how it affects water supply and water management, how it affects fire risk and fire management, so dealing with a full spectrum. We do the individual studies, but we also do a lot of technical assistance to both public and private sector decision makers. So I'm going to give you a bit of a whirlwind tour of climate impacts as it relates to ag, but I want to point out that there are three very recent synthesis products that have the details. To varying degrees. And I have three of them here, or the three key ones here. First is the National Climate Assessment, which came out just, well, April, I guess, not quite last month, 2 months ago. And that is a comprehensive look at climate, both observed and projected climate change for the United States. There are chapters specific to individual regions. So, for example, there's a Pacific Northwest chapter. It's fairly short, it's about 10, 12 pages or so. And there's also a chapter specific to agriculture that's looking at ag issues across the country. The website for this is also a very dynamic website, and you can link through to original sources. It's quite a good product. Going down to the scale of the Northwest, this middle file there, or the middle picture there, if you wouldn't mind holding that up, visual aids. You're welcome to pass that around, too, as long as I get it back before I leave. That is referred to in short as the Island Press Report. It's climate change in the Northwest, implications for our landscape, waters, and communities. This is a roughly 250-page detailed synthesis of climate impacts in the Northwest. There's a chapter on agriculture. You can download it as a PDF. The hard copies are available for purchase. We were part of the writing team, both on the individual chapters and in editing the whole document. And then the third is what we call a state of knowledge report. It is a synthesis report that is meant to be kind of your quick reference guide that's synthesizing key points from some of the major global studies, looking at global climate change as well as these regional studies. And it is bolded statements, bullet points with the numbers at the end of each chapter. So very quick reference, easy to use, individual chapters, one for ag, for example. So that's also available for download from our website. So I've included, you're posting this presentation? Or, yeah. So you can also just Google these documents, but you can download the National Climate Assessment from this link and these two reports from our special reports page on the Climate Impacts Group website. So on with the show. I'm going to start with a pretty blunt question. Why should I care? And in particular, given that the ag community is already dealing with so much variability from year to year. You know, why the concern about climate change? Well, I'm going to offer what I think are 4 key reasons. These are not the only reasons, but I think these are kind of the good big picture reasons. First, many of the issues that are important to the ag industry are sensitive to climate. And this includes, and to livestock managers, this includes water supply, food supply for animals, rangeland, access and quality, and I'll shed light on what I mean by that, and then animal health and productivity. So small changes in temperature can create, even today, can create very different stressors in each of these areas. Second, global and regional climate is already changing, and these changes are expected to accelerate in the coming decades. So we already deal with stresses, that is true, there's lots of year-to-year variability, but many of these changes are actually going to exceed the range of variability to which our systems are already adapted for and around which we've managed. So we are dealing in many cases with kind of new extremes or new normals that we may or may not be able to address easily. Significant changes are projected as a result of increasing temperatures and changes in precipitation. And frankly, the changes in the next few decades are largely unavoidable because of the greenhouse gases that are already in the atmosphere. There's a considerable lag time, so even if we stopped all CO2 emissions today, we would continue to see increasing temperature at least through the end of the century. And finally, additional tools and costs for managing the impacts may be required. So there are obviously lots of coping mechanisms for dealing with extreme events today, but what we may find as a result of climate change is that those coping mechanisms may need to be applied more often, more extensively, for longer periods of time. And additional tools that maybe before were cost prohibitive may suddenly start making more sense in a changing climate. So let's start with observed changes in Pacific Northwest climate. And for that, I'm going to rely on Yogi Berra. You can observe a lot just by watching. So we've seen an increase in average annual temperature in the Pacific Northwest of 1.3 degrees Fahrenheit. That's a long-term trend. It's important to note that over short periods of time, you can see periods of cooling. That's both at the seasonal time scales and at the annual time scales. That's normal, and it's largely a function of natural variability. We've seen warming in all seasons in that long-term record, except, interestingly enough, spring, recent spring. That period, 1980 to 2011, has actually seen a cooling. It's the one season where we've seen a trend, cooling trend. And that has to do largely with some very cool springs that we've had primarily between 2008 and 2011. It's really kind of pulled that trend line down. And natural variability, will continue to play an important role in shaping our climate and how we experience climate from, one year to the next. So things like El Nino and La Nina, which I think are kind of roll off people's tongues now because even, the local weatherman talks about the El Nino forecast that's coming up for this year and things like La Nina. Both of those can push us towards warmer, drier conditions in the case of El Nino or cooler, wetter conditions in the case of La Nina on an annual scale or on an annual basis. And there are other modes of variability that work at longer time scales which can also kind of tilt the odds one way or the other. So that will continue to play a role in our climate. The growing season has been lengthening. This is a figure from the National Climate Assessment looking at the change in the length of the growing season for 1991 to 2002. But I want to point out at the bottom, there's also information on the century scale trend. For those of you who can't see, it's the frost-free season has lengthened 35 days, plus or minus 6 days, between 1885 and 2011. So that creates both opportunities and challenges. And we've seen a change in the USDA hardiness zones. How many of you have seen this? Have you seen this comparison? So I'm going to toggle back and forth, but with the warming temperature trends, we've seen essentially a shift northward of the cooler zones and an expansion of the warmer zones. So just 1990, 2006. With precipitation, we haven't really seen much of a change. Maybe a slight increase in the long-term trend for precipitation, but we have such a huge range of natural variability that it's really hard to see anything meaningful. It's certainly not a statistically significant trend, whereas the trend in temperature is. We have seen maybe slightly higher variability. It's calculated to be an increase of about 16% since 1970. And in fact, most of our warming, or not most of our warming, our rate of warming has increased as well since 1970. So there's certainly, both at the global scale and at the regional scale, it really seems that kind of post-1970, the rates of change have picked up notably.
Laura, quick question.
Sure.
If you compared this chart with the temperature change chart you had earlier that showed the 1.3% Fahrenheit change. 1.3?
1.3 degrees Fahrenheit, yeah.
It changed from 1960 to 1991. He did the same chart here from 1960 to 1991.
So that was actually relative to 19...
it was a baseline in 1960,
right,
I think.
Yeah, that was the baseline. And okay, this, yeah, so okay. This is, but the period for this analysis is 1885 okay. to 2011. So even though, but we have seen evidence of increased extreme precipitation events, so an increase of about 12% for the Pacific Northwest region as a whole. And this is looking, essentially the second half of the century. There's nothing like a laser.
I mean, so the overall amount has not really changed, but it tends to come in more extreme events.
Yeah, exactly. And this is the top 1 percentile, the 99th percentile precipitation events. And the amount that constitutes will change from place to place. But this is looking at specifically the top 1% events. So, yeah, so again, this long-term trend shows maybe a slight, just a really slight increase. But it seems to be that when we get it, we are getting it in more extreme.
And this is like rain and snow.
This is specifically the top 1%, which would be rain. Yeah, I would assume it'd be specifically rain. Yeah, precipitation all gets lumped together, but I don't know if there's a snow event that would beat out a rain event in terms of. Maybe, yeah.
I mean, we've had some snow events over the last few years.
Yeah.
Lots of snow in a short period of time.
Right. Yeah, I don't know how they differentiate between snow and rain for these statistics.
They looked at when the precipitation happens, because one of the things I used to like when we were doing some teaching is that we showed that the rainfall in Seattle and Cedar Rapids, Iowa is both right around 37 inches right. annually. But Seattle is like this, it all happens in the winter and spring and then very dry in the summer.
Right.
And where Cedar Rapids, Iowa, you get a bell-shaped curve, and most of it happens during the growing season. I'm curious whether there's a shift in terms of, we're on the Pacific Northwest where we have dry summers, is there maybe more happening? Which would be a good thing if it's happening more, because last few years, at least it seems, we've had very wet springs and early summers.
Yes, we have, and that's largely been a function of the La Niñas that we've had, which La Niñas tilt the odds for cooler, wetter conditions, and we tend to see that most over that kind of October to March kind of spring period. The one, I am sure that there's some information about looking at any changes in the seasonality, and there's a paper by John Abotsoglu that may have some of that information. I don't recall it off the top of my head, but I do know, for example, that December used to be our wettest month and now November is. So there has been that kind of a shift that's been observed. So we've also seen a decline in glaciers in both the Cascades and the Olympics. This is looking at trends in glaciers over the last 100 years. Pretty robust finding of declines. And we've also seen a decline in spring snowpack as measured on April 1, roughly about 25%. The actual percentage loss will vary somewhat depending on when you actually start the analysis. But for pretty much any starting time between the 1930s and up to about 1970, you get declines of about 25%. As you move to shorter and shorter time periods, that influence of natural variability starts to play a stronger determinant. And so it becomes more easily skewed by if we've had a preponderance of, for example, El Nino years versus La Nina years or other modes. But pretty robust finding for declining snowpack, particularly at your low and mid elevation stations that already sit close to the freezing threshold. We've seen shifts in peak stream flow moving earlier. So this figure shows where you see the browns, the deeper the brown, it is the earlier the shift in timing of peak stream flow. But some of the rain-fed basins, is particularly in snowmelt basins, some of the rain-fed basins have actually shown a very slight increase. And that's probably due to that increase in precipitation, that slight increase in precipitation that's been observed. Summer low flows are decreasing. So getting a consistent theme here, both in terms of, these are typically the August flows, so the lowest flows of the year, looking at the 25th percentile in the mean. And you can see that around the region, the circles are the trends that are statistically significant, the squares are the ones that are not, but anywhere from a 0 to 50% decrease in the volume of your summer low flows. So, are these changes due to climate change or are they due to natural variability? Well, the answer, the evidence suggests, is both. And the reason why I want to point this out is that there is a tendency, I think, for some people to say climate change is causing all of these things. And there's another tendency for other people to say, no, it's all natural variability. And the reality is that both climate variability and climate change are occurring simultaneously. So the challenge is, can we pull out and actually in a percentage, from, like you can say X percentage is due to variability and X percentage is due to human-caused climate change. Well, that's called detection and attribution. That has actually been done globally, and it's actually been done for some things on the scale of the West, for example, snowpack and stream flow. And the human impact from climate change has been detected and quantified. It's harder to do as you move to smaller scales, again, because you have fewer data points and relative to, say, a global analysis. And you also see that that influence of variability starts to take on a stronger role and makes it harder to detect exactly when, exactly how much is due to variability and change. But what we know is that Pacific Northwest climate is changing in lots of ways that are consistent with warming temperatures and also consistent with changes that are happening elsewhere in the globe. So these changes are not unique to the Northwest. Glaciers and stream flows are declining in Europe, temperatures are rising globally. These are common stories. And as I mentioned, natural variability continues to play a role. So the common question is, will we see, and when we get to the future projections, will we see warmer, drier conditions, or will we see, wetter conditions, warmer, wetter? The answer is yes. We will continue to see above average years, warmer than average years, and drier than average years, and cooler than average years. And it's just that mean, around that average around which we're varying is going up over time. All right, so moving on to some of these projected changes. Again, going back to Yogi Berra, the future ain't what it used to be. We do expect to see rapid warming as a result of rising greenhouse gas emissions, and all scenarios indicate warming through the 21st century. This is showing the modeled results for two scenarios, a low emissions scenario and a high emissions scenario. This is specifically for the Pacific Northwest. And what you see by 2100 in the low emissions scenario is, roughly 5 degrees increase in annual average temperature. Under the high emissions scenario, that's roughly 10 degrees Fahrenheit average annual temperature. If we want to look at the 2050s in particular, which is, two things, a little bit easier for people to plan for because it's nearer term, but also the point before, or right around which we really start to see a divergence. We see increases in average annual temperature of about 4 to 6 degrees Fahrenheit. The numbers here are the ranges for these projections. And again, this divergence here, is going back to my previous point that in the next few decades through about mid-century, a lot of the warming that's expected is strictly a function of what's already in the atmosphere. Changes in greenhouse gas emissions really start to influence how much warming we see after about mid-century.
Quick question again.
Sure.
Does this translate, this is for the PNW region, on a global scale, the chart looks somewhat similar?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
What about at different latitudes? I've heard
Mhm,
more
it's-
in at the more northern or southern latitude, the more you approach the poles, there's more change than at more temperate climates or warmer climates.
Yeah, you actually get more warming up north. So, for example, the Arctic is projected to see the most warming of it.
Antarctica is not going to, I thought it was both poles, no?
Yeah, both poles, but yeah, showing my northern hemisphere bias here. Yeah, so as you move further north, the warming actually is projected to, the change is larger. We are expected to see continued variability in precipitation. Because we have such a huge range of variability, it's very difficult to tease out when the greenhouse gases really start to influence precipitation. Generally, we expect to see modest increases in average annual precipitation with an enhancement of our seasonal cycle. So wetter winters, drier summers. And the drier summers is a pretty robust finding. The wetter winters, there are some scenarios that show winter drying, but the majority show wetter winters. And we do expect to see more extreme precipitation as a result of the fact that a warmer atmosphere can hold more moisture. So how will these affect agriculture in the Northwest? So I'm focusing on these 4 particular aspects. So let's start with water supply. First, our primary mechanism for storing water, snow, is very sensitive to warming. We have actually the highest fraction of what they call warm snow in the US. This is snow that basically is sitting close to that 32 degrees freezing threshold. So it means that it doesn't take a lot of warming to make a big difference in how much snow that we see. So all scenarios at this point indicate a decline in snowpack in the region in the range of 45% for the 2040s, 65% for the 2080s. This is happening primarily because the warmer winter temperatures cause more winter precipitation to fall as rain rather than snow. This doesn't mean that there won't be any snow in the mountains. Up at those higher elevations that still remain below freezing, those areas will still continue to accumulate snow. But at that kind of mid-elevation band where a few degrees of warming really tips the balance, that's where you expect to see either more intermittent snow or no snow at all.
On these models that they do this, do they take an exponential of the amount of greenhouse gases because it's going to be how they built up since from the 60s, it's been incredible in the 60s on the amount we've produced since then. So are they taking that into account to get these rates?
Yeah, this is based on a medium emission scenario. This is specifically the A1B scenario, which is a little different than the RC. It's kind of equivalent to RCP 6.0, which is in the middle of what I showed you before. So in 2013, there was a switch in the scenario labels and kind of how they calculated them. But this is taking into account the warming that's driven by that rising greenhouse gas emissions. So if you choose different scenarios, you will get different statistics. And we do have this similar results for the B1 scenario, which is a low emissions scenario. I don't show that for 2 reasons. First of all, it makes the slide very busy. And number 2, this is probably more reflective of where we're headed than the B1. But even then, the B1, the 2080s, the losses are still above 50%.
I'm sure they've looked at, I'm thinking about lived for years on the west side, and since most of the rain falls on the west side, you said winters are going to get wetter, and there's going to be a lot more falling as rain. There's going to be a lot more flooding.
There is an increased risk of flooding, particularly on the west side. Yeah. And that's a slide I should have included in here. But yes, there is an increased risk of flooding on the west side, particularly in basins that already flood in kind of that November, December time period. Those are the ones where we're...
lived in Carnation for a year.
Yeah.
Twice badly there. That poor valley's just going to be underwater.
Yeah, we have projections on changes in the 2050 and 100-year flood flows for more than 300 stream flow locations in the Pacific Northwest, and it's a pretty robust finding. Except in your rain-dominant basins, which are the ones where there's no snow, there it's a slight increase in flooding just because it's really contingent on how much precip we get. In these snow-fed systems, whether they're snow-dominant or kind of these transient basins, it's really that warming temperature that's causing the shift that drives the flood risk.
So back question, when you talked about that band of kind of warm snow, so like for instance, snow quality past what, for 2,000 feet?
3,000 feet, yeah.
So then if this comes to be, that would mostly be rain and not snow?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, the offhand joke is, probably not a good time to own a season's pass, or, season's pass maybe, purchases may be limited, but again, it's not to say that no snow will show up there, but when it'll be much more transient in nature. So this does have an effect on stream flow. This is a typical hydrograph for one of these transient or mixed rain snow basins where we see the peak in the winter, or a slight uptick in the winter, and then the big spring peak. And I'll move through these quickly. What we see as a result of these warming temperatures and this shift is essentially a transformation in flows, where in the case of the Yakima, instead of the peak runoff coming in kind of that May-June period, we're now seeing it coming off in the winter. This is representative of the sensitivity of many of the basins, but the results will differ from basin to basin. We also are expecting to see reduced summer stream flows at most locations. So this is similar to that previous figure I showed you. This was also produced by someone in our group for the National Climate Assessment, but the darker the brown, the bigger the decrease in summer flows. And increasing summer soil moisture deficit is expected, particularly in the interior. So bottom line for water, decreasing summer water supply and increased demand for competing water uses, which I didn't show you the results for hydropower or municipal and industrial or fish, but those are also water uses that are affected by these changes. So you have all of those users trying to meet their obligations as well. Just as an example of what this means potentially for water rights, water shortage years in the Yakima Basin increased from 14% to roughly 43 to 68% by the 2080s. Okay, food production, and I will try to move through these quickly. Is it okay if I take it? Okay. So this is one of the food production in terms, this is one of those areas where it's a real mixed bag. There are some crops that are, at least the studies show, should do fairly well, and there are some that will not. I'm focusing here on, in particular, on the grains and cereals. The chapter in the book, which is making its way around, the ag book, they also looked at potatoes and irrigated agriculture, cherries, apples, et cetera. So there are a number of crops that have been looked at in this region. But what we expect is a mix of increased or decreased yields, and it's really sensitive to the kind of assumptions that are made. But some of the key drivers of change are the likelihood for increased summer heat stress, decreased water supply, the longer growing season, which in those shoulder seasons, spring and fall, actually may be a benefit. Increased winter precipitation and milder winters, which could be a benefit for some winter crops. The CO2 fertilization effect is actually one of those things, and I'll show you, that really makes a big difference. So this is the notion that it's not a notion, it's that as CO2 concentration increases in the atmosphere, you do actually see a benefit for some plant types. This is where it gets down to whether it's a C3 versus a C4 plant type. And you do see a benefit in the models when you do these studies. There are other factors that could change that, though. For example, if there's not water available, no matter how much CO2 benefit you're getting. And there are also lots of weeds that also benefit from that CO2 as well. So you may see, it's not just the agricultural crops that benefit. And then we could see, as I inferred, changes in plant diseases, pests, and weeds as a result of increasing temperatures and the CO2 effect. So, focusing on winter and spring wheat, absent a CO2 fertilization effect, there's actually a decrease in yields in Washington State. And the key issue there is the drier and warmer summers and the lower summer soil moisture. I showed you that soil moisture deficit figure. But put in the CO2 fertilization effect, and actually a lot of those decreasing yields flip to increasing yields. So in the range of about 10 to 35%. So again, potential benefit there. But it's definitely sensitive to which scenarios are used and the time frames. So it's basically looking at,
Once it's absent, now you're using it,
Mhm.
and that's still taking into effect the lower soil moisture,
yep,
and we still could have increases in yields?
yeah, yep. And then the spring wheat, the results for that are not as favorable. And this is explained in some detail in the ag chapter. And actually, a lot of this work was done by Claudio Stappo here at WSU. So he's a good, and then the REACH folks, I think, are looking at this too.
Is there evidence of decreased nutritional quality of those crops? Because there is
Yep.
pasture and forage.
I will get to that. All right, so although I hadn't heard it addressed in this context, I have that point related to pasture and forage. So here are the caveats that go before we get too excited about the potential for increasing yields. The models don't account for heat stress. These are based primarily on changes in average temperature. So, and heat stress can accelerate that time between maturity and death of the plant, and it can also reduce photosynthesis and cause grain shriveling. So that heat stress is not, so those times when we kind of exceed the normal temperatures are not incorporated into the models. And it doesn't take into account the fact that some pests may benefit from climate change as well as some weeds. Also, it was noted in that agricultural chapter that the timing of precipitation can really matter. And this is where, for example, the timing of winter precipitation could affect spring planting if it falls, positively or negatively. And similarly, warmer, drier summers could impede the planting of winter wheat in the late fall, or in the fall, late summer, early fall. So going on to rangelands, this is where we see some elevational differences. So for any of those rangelands that are higher elevation, maybe more up in the mountains, those may benefit from increasing temperatures. Also, because you see earlier snow melt, which allows essentially a longer growing season for the grasses. But you also see, and this is the point that you were getting at, reduced digestibility potentially with, at least some experiments have found that with some of these short grass steppe species. And then it could also increase pressure for invasive species. So one of the key points from this agricultural chapter was that these grazing systems that are kind of in the marginal areas may actually see decreasing profitability as a result. We are also expecting to see a pretty substantial increase in fire risks, especially on the east side of the Cascades. There is an increase expected on the west side of the Cascades, but it is not as significant. We get fewer fires on the west side of the Cascades. There's actually a lot of fuel to burn, so if we do get a big fire, or if we get a fire, it has the potential to become a very big one. But the primary story is on the east side of the Cascades, where both the combination of drier soil moisture and decreasing snowpack, which essentially lengthens that window for drying, and then the increased summer temperatures increase the fire risk, which of course could affect grasslands as well as rangelands that may be up in forested areas.
Did they look at the effect of mild winters on some of the pests and so forth?
Pine beetle.
Pine beetle,
Yep.
and spruce foot aphid, and something called spruce foot.
I'm not sure about that one, but pine beetle is well studied, yeah. And what you see as a result of warmer, this is already being seen in British Columbia. And it's partly what's happening in British Columbia and the decimation of the pine forests up in BC is both a function of climate and also just forest practices. So what's happening though is with warmer temperatures, the pine beetle is able to get in an extra generation. So there are more pine beetles to infest the forests. Then they're natural to this area. They're not invasive. So what's happening is just that those climate controls on their populations are not there. We're not getting those deep, cold, killing temperatures, and it's the timing of those cold air outbreaks. The pine beetle can actually, it creates antifreeze during the deep, cold winter. That's how it survives the deep, cold winter. So it's really those cold air outbreaks that happen in the fall or the spring when it hasn't kind of hardened its system that really will have the biggest impact on pine beetle populations. So we're losing those in those scenarios, and that's what's allowing them to get in extra life cycles. In Washington, what we see is is an expansion of the pine beetle, but also they're moving up in elevation, so there's something of a time limit in the sense that, you know, eventually they run out of trees. You can only move so far up in elevation. So you see this kind of like this bulge mid-century, and then later in the century, the actual area affected by pine beetle goes down just because they've moved up in elevation. It exacerbates the fire risk. It already is exacerbating fire risk, and it will continue to do so.
So
And-
some of this data, though, would be an excellent justification of why we need to be grazing animals in a lot of these areas where there's a lot of understory to reduce fire risk. We could use this for justification.
I stay out of the policy discussions. Yeah, no, I mean, there are,
It's an
yeah.
adaptation.
It is an adaptation, and DNR is looking at this, is very active in looking at how to adapt management of trust lands and state forest lands, and so, and I think probably looking for creative solutions to help manage fire risk, because there's no one silver bullet. Pasture and forage land, you know, there's not very much research, but the research that has been done indicates the point that you raised earlier, that actually the nutritional value goes down as we see more CO2. So, you know, we may see increased growth as a result of the CO2 fertilization effect, but the nutritional quality is going down. And this also, in this case with alfalfa, was assuming that the water is not a limiting factor there. So I'm going to close with milk and beef production. So for beef cattle, there's some work that's been done for the 7 western states. And basically what they found is that with higher temperatures, you see an increase in the number of days required to reach their finished weights. So, you know, roughly 2 to 3% with a doubling of CO2. So to put this in perspective, we're at 400 parts per million now. So this is doubling from pre-industrial levels, not from where we're at now. Tripling would be 840 parts per million. That high emission scenario I showed you before, or it was one that was RCP 8.5 that had us at 10 degrees Fahrenheit average annual temperature, that's about that level. That's about 900 parts per million. So an increase of 15%. You know, is that a big deal? I don't know. That's for you to tell me, but it does raise costs. Then there was a group down in Oregon, the Climate Leadership Initiative, that took this information and actually calculated what the economic impact was, and roughly 2 to 15% depending on the time frame. And that's just looking specifically at the issue of the finishing weights. Milk?
Does that just due to heat stress?
Yeah. That's my understanding, although there may be other factors. It's often rarely one factor. So that has to do with the energetic requirements. When it gets hot, they drink more, eat less. Same thing for dairy cows. And so there's just this energetic expenditure. So we've got a paper, and I'm happy to send it to you, Liz, a paper that's in press right now on milk production in the U.S., how climate change could affect milk production in the U.S. And what that work found was, it's probably not news to you, when temperatures go up, milk production goes down. But interestingly enough, Washington is projected to see losses in milk production, at least when they examined Yakima County, and I'll show you those results. But we may fare better than other parts of the country, so it may be, things may not be as good here, but they may be a whole lot better than other parts of the country. So this may be one area where, for example, what's happening in other parts could still benefit milk prices and Washington's dairy producers. So this is showing you one of the things that was key from this study. They did a couple of different ways of examining how temperature affects loss. There was a more traditional way that just assumed a linear loss of how many pounds of milk were lost for every degree temperature change. But then they noticed that didn't really match observed very well, and they started taking into account humidity. And it's really that combination of temperature and humidity that plays, that influences milk production, and that's why you see so much more milk being lost down in the southeast, which is not a huge milk production area, but even in Central California, which is, you do see that. And here, again, some decrease there, but not a huge amount. So let's move down to Yakima. So these figures show results. They looked at 10 counties. And I put up a couple of counties just so you could see some of the differences. California, and here's New York, and then Yakima. And what this is just showing is the different analyses that they did. And the traditional analyses, you know, are these gray lines. The observed are the black lines. So the key thing that you want to look at is the difference between the historical and the dashed line here. And that dip is showing you the decline in milk production. But you'll notice it's also widening. So, and you know, how much it widens really depends on where you are. Arizona really takes a big hit. Not a huge dairy area, but nevertheless, dairy production there was the most sensitive to these changes. And so you see a lengthening of that window of time when production is going down, and then you also see a decrease in the volume per cow. So these, and that was actually priced out. The economic impact of that loss was priced out in this paper. So basically a loss of, you know, $4 to $5.5 million for the industry per year. So I want to close with just some adaptation options. There are a lot. And many of the tools that you already use to deal with extreme events are tools, as I mentioned earlier, that are still very relevant, but may have to be deployed at different scales. There may be new tools that previously were not considered economically, you know, worth the investment that might start to make more sense as farmers start planning for the future. So some of these adaptation options include what's listed here, anywhere from changes in the types of crops that are grown or the genetic makeup of those crops, as well as the genetic, the crossbreeding that was mentioned earlier. It was noted in this dairy paper that a lot of the genetic selection that's been done to increase milk production actually makes the cows more vulnerable to the heat and humidity impacts. So you've got, you know, kind of competing interests there in the sense of if you want to try to start breeding for heat, you know, more heat resilience, will that come at a cost of less milk production even in other times of the year? So different crops rotation, different management for irrigation, and facility modifications for confined operations, you know, installing shade sprinklers, evaporative cooling systems, for example. These are just some of the options that are available. So, but your question in terms of, you know, how do we differentiate between, you know, the emergency management planning versus maybe the kind of adaptation that would be required for some of these longer term changes, this is where some of these really start to come into effect, because if you want to start doing, if you want to consider moving to a different breed or doing selective breeding for crops or for cattle or dairy cows, that takes time. Also, if you want to be investing in facility infrastructure, those can be expensive, and you know, that kind of planning for different infrastructure, it can be important. And then when you talk about the west side flood risks, you know, you may want to, if you're replacing a barn, for example, and you're in a flood zone, maybe knowing that the flood risk increases on the west side means that you build that barn up, you raise that barn up. Or maybe you have a, you know, difference in choice, you know, a choice between place A and place B, and place B may not be as convenient, but it's more resilient to the projected flood risks. So all of this information can factor into different types of decisions, ranging from physical infrastructure investments to operations to even just, you know, what we're growing or raising. So I'll just throw those up, long list of key points to recap. Hopefully I've touched on all these. If not, here's my last chance to make sure I mention some of them. So, you know, as I've indicated, global and regional climate is changing, and that these changes are going to accelerate in the coming decades. I didn't talk about that. It's like, it's not only that these temperatures are changing, but it's the rate of change that's important. And the rate of change that we're seeing is significant. And that can make it difficult to adapt, reactively at least. Many, as I've mentioned and highlighted here, many of the issues important to ag are sensitive to climate and will become more sensitive based on these projections. And as I noted, you know, impacts are mixed. We may see some benefits. You know, maybe dairy production benefits from the fact that it's becoming harder to produce the same volume of milk in other parts of the country. Same thing with crops, but that doesn't mean we are without challenges even for that work here in the state. There are lots of adaptation options. There's lots of information to help support that kind of decision making. I've shown some of it here, but I've pointed you to some references that would have some more. And of course, you're welcome to call the Climate Impacts Group anytime. And then at this one, I didn't have a slide for, but I think it goes without saying that what happens in other parts of the world and other parts of the U.S. affect the prices that really dictate and drive a lot of decisions. And so really when, if you want to talk about an impact that's truly, or a sector that's truly integrative in nature, it's really agriculture, because it does matter what's happening in China, or what's happening in the Southeast, or what's happening, in Europe, and how that influences prices for the commodities grown in Washington, and how that influences what we want to grow and where, those will be affected by climate change as well, and certainly be an important input to decision making. I want to close just by providing our email address, and also point out that the Pacific Northwest Climate Science Conference is going to be at UW on September 9th and 10th. And we do have several good abstracts that were submitted for ag, so I think we have enough to have a concurrent session on ag, which is great. Next year's will be probably in Boise, if you want to wait for something that's closer. But as the organizer of this year's conference, I can tell you it's going to be great. So come in purple, and but I welcome you to come. It'll be a good conference. It brings about 250 to 300 people, scientists, practitioners. It's a good mix.
Thank you so much, Lara.